This report really delves into the challenge of the loneliness epidemic that is in the world at the moment, and the need, the actual human need, and the benefits of bringing people together face to face, and really positioning events as a driver for social change and social good.
Welcome to another episode of Production Value Matters, the Business Events Podcast. Today, I'm really excited to be welcoming Carina Bauer, CEO of the IMEX Group, a global leader in the business events industry. With a career spanning from retail and catering to spearheading one of the most influential trade shows in the world, Carina has been at the forefront of driving innovation in events for over 2 decades. Under her leadership, IMEX has not only expanded internationally, but has also embraced cutting-edge strategies to evolve with the changing landscape of business events. A champion of the industry-wide progress, Carina has played a key role in advancing diversity, sustainability, and digital transformation in the event space. Work that has recently earned her an outstanding contribution to the industry award from the Association of Event Organizers. Carina, it is such a pleasure to finally have you on the show. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great. So let's start off with your journey. You've been with IMEX for over 2 decades, shaping the future of live events. What initially drew you to the industry, and what continues to inspire you after all these years?
Yeah, so people may not know, but I kind of grew up in the industry. You know, my father, Ray Bloom, is our chairman. He's the founder of IMEX. Previously, he was the founder of IBTM World, which is a trade show that takes place in Barcelona. And so I kind of grew up going to that trade show and also spending summer holidays at some of the industry's best known conventions in the States. So the industry, when I first came into it, was actually very familiar to me. I actually, as you said in the intro, started off in retail catering, then went off and did a ski season. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And one of the launch team for IMEX Frankfurt actually became ill, and I stepped in at the time to just help out for the first show, and intended to leave actually, but I really enjoyed it. I think partly I got it, I understood it, was familiar, but also I like the idea, like for events, that you create something and you see it come to fruition and you feel it and you then can kind of start again and make it better. And I think that is what probably drew me in. And I think that's what's kept me in as well, that sort of iterative innovation process I find very fulfilling and exciting and creative. And so that's, I think, why I'm still here 23 years later, or whatever it is.
Yeah, it sometimes feels like you can't have an escape because you're just sort of. I think the thing that I sometimes say to people is like, I could be an accountant, but like I just can't get away from this. I can't help myself. So before we dive into some details, let's just take a step back and look at the industry as a whole. What's one of the biggest frustrations or challenges you see event professionals facing right now? And why do you think that persists? And how do you think it's shaping the future of events?
I think one of our difficulties it is as an industry is that we are what I call a horizontal industry. So we are across all other sectors. And as a result, we can often seem quite hidden. It's harder for us to really control and measure the deeper impact of our work. And as a result of that, you know, when difficulties come up, you know, we've seen that in waves over the years, often that can be hard. It can be difficult for us to get our voice out as an industry. So I think that's one of the things that we suffer from. We're much better at it nowadays because of the financial crisis and everything that happened around that time. COVID as well galvanized people in the industry to come together and advocate and measure our impact and learn how to describe our impact and the importance of our industry in both economic terms and more legacy terms, to whether it's lawmakers and policymakers or whether it's corporate executives. So I think we're better at that, but I think we've still got some way to go. And that is something that's always sort of bubbles up in tougher times.
So do you think there are any sort of legacy mindsets or traditional approaches that are holding the industry back right now?
I think we do have a very strong focus on the economic data. And whilst that's good, that often aligns us very much with the tourism outputs. But the reality is that you don't have a meeting because you want to fill a hotel. That is a side effect of the fact that you're bringing people together. We have a meeting, we bring people together in order to advance change, advance research, drive forward business objectives, motivate people. That's why we actually hold these gatherings or provide human connections, develop relationships. So that's actually what we should be measuring. But because it's harder to measure, we end up measuring the tourism outputs. And as a result, we get put into hospitality and tourism, which we're aligned with, but that's not the reason why we exist. And I think if we were able to better measure the reason why we exist, we would have a better narrative to explain.
Yeah, that is I think you're certainly touching on an issue we've talked about on this podcast many times. And you're right that a lot of event professionals continue to struggle with those measurable outputs. And you've got a very fair point that the easiest one is heads and beds, as we've all heard across the industry, and why I think there are a lot of tourism agencies that are so closely aligned with the travel and tourism industry. But event professionals are always struggling to define the real output of that, which I'd love to get back to in a couple minutes. But let's just talk about your latest report, The Power of Experiences, and that's redesigning events for human connection. Can you walk us through some of the key themes of the report and what inspired IMEX to explore these topics in the first place?
So every year we have a talking point, and our talking point for 24 and 25 is impact. But this year we wanted to look at impact through three specific lenses. One of those lenses is really looking at the science of social connection. And this report really delves into the challenge of the loneliness epidemic that is in the world at the moment, and the actual human need and the benefits of bringing people together face to face, and really positioning events as a driver for social change and social good. And we really see that events can be that real positive enforcement of relationship building. And so we wanted to delve into that aspect. In later months, we will delve into other aspects of impact in terms of next gen, and also looking at risk factors and the future. But this report really is focusing on how you create experiences to really drive that return on relationships and human connections, and how valuable that is for society as a whole, not just our industry.
Yeah, we often say in events that, hey, we're not saving lives, but I honestly think that is untrue, especially now that we have the ability to save the world. And because we are so focused on bringing people together and creating those connections. So I'm glad the report is sort of hitting on that. So what is a major finding from the report that you think event professionals should absolutely be paying attention to?
I think there were a few key areas. As I say, I think one thing that we would like people to take away from this report is that mindset shift that face-to-face events are playing a very vital role in fostering community and belonging. And if we are thinking about events in that way, then we really have to think about how we strategically and deliberately design events so that they achieve that goal. And so it's a more strategic focus than just thinking about the room nights and the food and the beverage, but really looking about how we can utilize the events that we are creating to drive human connection and drive relationships. And we call that in the report inclusive and intentional event design. And of course, there's been a lot of talk in the industry about inclusion, about belonging, and also about event design. We're really trying within this report to give people some easy ways to think about that and bring those concepts together.
So, looking at the findings of the report, was there some kind of big aha moment? Was there an insight or statistic that challenged your conventional thinking about events?
I think really the aha moment was delving into some of the research, which isn't about events at all, but really is research that delves into the issues that people are facing at the moment in terms of social isolation and how the pandemic has really reinforced some of these trends and also things like remote working. So I think the aha moment is less about the events themselves, but more about really what society is going through at the moment. And the fact that the pandemic is long over, and certainly I think people feel that in the US even more so than in Europe. Nobody wants to talk about it anymore, but the effects are quite far-reaching, especially on the younger generation, and especially on people who have never quite fully got back into society as a result. And I think for me, anyway, reading our own report, that in some ways was the biggest sort of aha moment. And as I say, how we as an industry can play a very important role in helping people to get reconnected into society and into communities of different kinds. And that's what events do, really, don't they? Because ultimately, you can nowadays consume content and information online quite easily. So the reason for coming to events has changed. And I think we know that, but I think this report builds some of the science behind why that is. And certainly at an event like IMEX, IMEX America last year was 16,000 people, but we always talk about IMEX in terms of the ability to create micro events and micro communities and micro experiences within this kind of mega event. And that's very important in terms of that intentional design, that you really make sure that you're building out your event to drive that community connection, because that's really what we're existing for now.
Yeah, that epidemic of loneliness that you mentioned, which is a direct sort of consequence of the pandemic, and I think you're absolutely right that, like, although we may not want to talk about it that much anymore, we may want to say that we've moved on. Those lingering effects have sort of persisted, and so. I mean, you talked about how you think it's widespread from there, but this is affecting attendees, employees, our audiences from CEO to entry-level professionals. Given the findings of your report, where do you see events playing a role in countering that?
Yeah, I think events can play a very strong role. As I say, I think you need to think about how your event is going to include the right community. We all create events for different communities and people. So you have to think right from the start, I think, about that inclusive design. You have to be very intentional about it. And you have to make sure that the way the event flows, if you like, how it runs, gives space for those relationships to be built and to be fostered and for shared experiences to really happen. I read about an event, or I think one of my colleagues was telling me about an event where the content was fantastic, but the way it was designed, it wasn't maybe a great welcome and entry experience. There was no real ability for people that weren't in the special VIP group to connect with each other, to even eat and share bread together. And so she left feeling like she had had a very interesting content experience and a very poor human experience. So I guess really what this report highlights, and what we talk about as well through our education and through other content that we do, is how can we really design events to foster that human element, that human experience that is about being inclusive in every way that you can think, being accessible, but it is also about how you design very intentionally networking events or opportunities for people to connect at a deeper level. For example, I was in site in Cancun a few weeks ago, in Tulum actually, the site is always very good at really immersing you in the destination as well as in the event. And a part of that is creating experiences where people have fun together, and do destination immersions together. So I think we need to think about content in a broad way. It's not just about the keynote speaker, but it's people are coming in order to develop their networks, essentially. And sometimes there's a very human need for that.
Yeah, I love how you're touching on this because I think there was a big focus post-pandemic on content, content being king, especially when you're in an online or virtual or digital event platform. What's really going to, I think, as you said, the keynote, it was more important, like this intimate time with this one person who has this great idea or the session or whatever it is. Do you think that to create those experiences, do we as event professionals need to focus more on things like entertainment and experience design rather than content going forward?
I think the balance, is dependent on your audience and the objectives of the event. So I don't think there's a one size fits all, but I do think any event that's organized and any event that's going to appeal as well to the younger generation that is coming through. And Freeman has got some amazing research about how I think by 2030, Gen Z is going to be the biggest population in the workforce. So that's going to have a massive impact on our events. I think if the design of the the drive for return on relationships, if the design of the event isn't conducive to that, I think people will be less inclined to return to that event year on year. Because ultimately, the content matters. It's not that it doesn't matter. It's just that it's not everything. And I think the drive for relationships is more important. The digital world means that we are connected to people all the time, but in a very superficial way. So how can events, when you're with someone face to face, you really can sort of see their body language, delve into what they're really thinking, have deeper conversations. You can develop your relationship. You can read people better and develop trust. That's really is becoming a much more critical part of the event mix. How you balance that, I think, is dependent. If you're doing the AIDS conference to bring doctors together to share research, you got to design that into your content very strongly. And site, which is for incentive travel professionals, that's going to be more destination immersion. It's different. But I think both of them need that ability to drive the relationship and human connection element. Because, we see in lots of research the fact that events are the number one source of driving trust with brands, for example. They are the number one channel for marketing executives to build brand trust. And why is that? It's because, increasingly we don't know what to trust online. So we can get a lot of information online, but we don't know what's real. At an event, you know what's real because you're face to face with people. And so we have to lean into that as we look at the design, I think.
Yeah, so let's go on to that topic, which was from a big thing from your report, which is that return on relationships metrics. We're seeing that shift from traditional ROI metrics to a relational impact. Why do you think this change? We've talked about this a little bit, but why this change is happening, and so how how can event professionals better measure that ROR, and ensure that relationship building translates into a long-term business value?
Yeah, and again, I think how you measure is dependent on the event you run. Um, First, I would say it's not easy, and I don't think we have a one sort of silver bullet solution for measuring that. I mean, of course, you need to think about the questions that you're asking your attendees. You also, I think, need to look at maybe working with some of your either attendees or exhibitors or sponsors in terms of helping them to understand their objectives and measure that over a period of time and be involved in some way in doing that with them. Because a lot of event work, and especially relationship work, is developed over time. So you can't just measure it based on what happens in the room on that day. And then there are other ways, to measure using some of the technology. So there's sentiment measurements, for example. You can use facial analysis nowadays to do things like that. So I think I guess what I'm saying is there are a number of metrics that can be looked at. I think you need to work out what your attendee base is. And how you can work with them to measure that over time. So I don't know if you get sort of a 60, 70% return on your attendee base, what can you ask them 1 year about last year and the relationships they built and those types of questions. So rather than looking at it as a one-hit wonder, like what am I going to ask them the day after the event?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about inclusivity for a second. It's no longer a nice to have, it's a must. What practical steps should event organizers take to create more inclusive and welcoming experiences for attendees?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things you can do. I mean, at a very basic level, we should be looking at accessibility in its broadest sense. So for me, inclusivity is about looking at every kind of possible attendee or sponsor or exhibitor and thinking about how you can make your event environment as welcoming as possible. So we've done a lot of work on accessibility. We still have a long way to go, but even simple things we've learned over the last few years, like publishing menus in advance so people with food allergies know that they can get the food that they need in advance of the show, publishing a accessibility routing or a little video of your venue. So maybe if you have mobility issues, you know how you'll get around. All these things make it more likely that that person will feel genuinely welcomed to come to that event and more comfortable coming. And then, of course, it's inclusivity in looking at where people are coming from, gender, race, nationality, and just making sure that you are, whether it's in the speakers that you have on stage, whether it's the marketing materials that you're putting out, whether it's the language that you're using, trying to just be thoughtful, I suppose, to those different groups. And also, I think with all of this, when you don't get things right, not trying to hide that, because I think people understand that it's hard and that nobody's perfect. And so I think just being open and transparent and saying what you are trying to do and then correcting when you might make a mistake, I think those things go a long way as well.
And so do you have a particular example of an event that has successfully embraced inclusive design? And for you, what made it stand out and what do you think other organizers can learn from that example?
Yeah, well, I hate to sort of give only IMEX examples, but one thing that we've been doing for the last few years, which has actually really worked for us, and we can see it in our metrics as well, is actually a focus on first-timers. So we had feedback, we could see in our evaluation data post-show that the satisfaction levels of people who had come to the show for the first time was a little bit below those returners. And we looked into that and we realized that maybe the IMEX experience was quite overwhelming in your first time. And so we put just a few things in place to support people who were coming for the first time. So pre-show webinars, a web page with tips and tricks, a LinkedIn group where people could, help each other, a meetup on the first morning of the show, just little things. And over the past couple of years, we've seen those evaluation metrics tick up. And so we can literally see in the data that our first timers are more satisfied with their first time experience at the show than they were a couple of years ago. And I look at that and I think that wasn't very difficult, actually. It took a bit of time and a bit of thought. It wasn't hugely expensive. Or even time consuming. It just took somebody in the team to be passionate about it and be focused on it. So for me, I think that was really good learning, actually, that you can do these things and those little touches can make a really big difference.
So let's talk about another key takeaway from the report, the power of imaginative and personalized experiences. What are some of the most creative ways event organizers can enhance personalization and make their events feel truly tailored to each participant?
Yeah, well, one of the things that has worked well for us is working in partnership with different organizations. So, in doing that, in working with all sorts of trade associations, community groups within the industry, it allows the show to become a real community event where, as I said before, you have those micro experiences that we can possibly develop ourselves. So I think one of the powerful things to do as an organizer is to let go a little bit, actually, and allow your community to actually make the event their own. And I think that is something that's really important, because if you do that, it will genuinely be meaningful for the people who are coming. Because as the organizer, you can't possibly know all the details and the specifics of what each community in your world needs. And so that's something that I think can work well. The other thing I think is giving choice. And again, thinking about the design of your event so that there is sufficient flexibility for people to have agency over the way they experience your event. I think that's also really important. The concept of choice, the concept of not just doing what we are told and having autonomy, I think, is increasingly important in the world. And therefore, when you come to an event, you want to experience an event how you want to experience it. Do you want to sleep in late, or do you want to be up for the run at 6 a.m.? Do you want to have back-to-back education sessions, or are you a person that does one education and then needs a break and then needs a chat with someone and then has another education session? We're all different. And so I think it's important to think about the design of your event in terms of giving choice and not over scheduling, essentially. And so those are just a couple of ways. I mean, we've also used something called Storycraft Labs experience profiles. Don't have to use those, but the experience profiles was a really nice way of generating excitement and community between people pre-show. They took a quick test, a fun little test. It gave them their profile. People online were sharing, what profile are you? I'm this profile. And then it gave them a suggested trail through the show. So what that meant was that it's just said, if you're this profile, you might enjoy these education sessions. We recommend these experiences. You might enjoy a walk at this time. And it just gave people a way to navigate the show based on that sort of slightly fun, but also scientific profiling. So that, again, is a simple way to both foster community and engagement, but also give people a way to inclusively experience the event.
Yeah, I love that idea of that sort of room and breadth to discover a little bit on your own. That's certainly been a trend over the last few years. AI tools are being used more and more to be able to quantify and segregate those experiences. As you said, like if you match this persona, then here is the suggestion. Do you think that there might be, and this is sort of a side question, do you think that there might be some kind of value because as I said, we've seen some of that across the industry. Certainly IMEX is doing that, and a lot of client events are sort of trying to tailor specific experiences and to give attendees that breadth and ability to I keep on thinking choose your own adventure model. Is there a value, do you think, about a more curated thing that uses potentially AI to be able to set the baseline, but that when you talk about those hyper personalized experiences, is there a downfall to relying too heavily on that kind of a tool, and not sort of having that curated human touch into it to make those hyper personalized experiences feel extremely unique? And I just think of an example of like two people with the same persona looking at their app on the phone and saying, "Oh, we're on the same journey, but we're individuals." So where does that personalization come in?
Yeah, I guess like everything, it's a balance, isn't it? And you don't want to feel that you're also sort of stuck to this journey that a machine has created for you. At the same time, as technology does develop, I think AI tools will be able to make suggestions, certainly, that are probably better in some cases than a human, especially when you have many hundreds or thousands of people at an event. If your AI tool really does understand your needs, making recommendations for who to meet and some of the sessions to go to, I think can be really useful because it can be overwhelming and it can be a lot of work to go through those lists. And even, session lists, however nicely they're designed, you still got to go through them. So I think there's a real value there for AI tools, but I always look at it as sort of recommendations rather than forced matches. And maybe that's because I really value my autonomy, and I wouldn't, if I think about my own experience, I wouldn't want to be in a situation where I'm told what I have to do. But I do like to have good recommendations, good suggestions. And I think sometimes when that happens as well, I'd like to think that you might end up meeting somebody or going to a session that you might not have thought of otherwise. And at the same time, as an attendee, I want to have time to find and discover. And I think that's also one of the joys of being at an in-person live event, that it's not all sort of curated for you. It's not a virtual event where you're, just watching the screen and the clock tick down. You are, discovering at the time and you're saying, well, oh, actually, I was going to go to that session, but I really fancy a coffee now. So I'm going to go and do that and then meet this amazing person in the hallway. And then your event takes a completely different spin, and the value of the event might be actually the biggest value might have been that person that you met in the hallway. So, we have to, I think, as an organizer, I suppose what I'm saying is put ourselves in the attendee shoes, think of ourselves, how we behave when we're an attendee. And the key for me always and with everything is balance. You have to balance all these things. There's no perfection. It's not just AI or just serendipity. We have to use these things to our advantage and trust our audience to make great decisions because they know what they need.
Yeah, I think the key thing that I take away from that is just the suggestion, right? Like if you create the suggestion of things and recommendations and all of those, but then leave that ability for serendipity. I think when people look at AI tools across all industries, including ours, they think, oh well, I put some inputs in and it spat me out a result, and it's telling me that should be the plan. It's sort of when we talk about general content across all channels, the more and more AI is relied on too much or any tool is relied on too much to do the thing, and not as a suggested way of doing these things. And then I'm going to put my human curation on that, and I'm going to put my particular spin and add that sort of breadth to it. That's just the key takeaway from this conversation that I take, is that it's really about creating those recommendations in a more effective and effective might not be the right word, certainly a more efficient way to make those suggestions for 1,000 people coming to your event, rather than an intern bleeding from the fingers from typing so much. So I think that's the key takeaway there for me. So, um, IMEX has also experimented, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, with some sentiment scoring using facial analysis. What's been the key learning from that approach, and do you see that becoming more of a standard metric in the industry?
I think it depends on what you need it for. We have utilized that specifically for some of our sponsor activations and also some of the areas of the show where we've invested particularly heavily. In all our areas of the show, if I take the hosted buyer lounge as an example, our team have created design briefs for each area of the show. So we know in those areas where we're investing how we want people to feel in those areas. So we've thought about that. Like, what are we trying to create if it's a hosted bar lounge? We want people to feel energized. Is this a space for decompression? How long do we want them to dwell there, etc. And similarly for our sponsors, especially when they're putting in large investments, we try to work with them so that if they're investing in those spaces, that they understand the design brief, but also that we understand what they need to get from it. So I think in those contexts, the sentiment analysis can be really valuable because we take a baseline in, maybe just the hallway of the show of general sentiment. And then in these other areas, looking at sentiment analysis, we can see, has the sentiment, are people more engaged? Are they happier? Are they more excited? Are they less excited? It was interesting because we used to the sentiment going up. So an increase in excitement level, say at a sponsorship activation. And that was what we're usually looking for. And then we did it in the sort of recharge lounge, the wellness lounge. We called it the resilience room. And we saw the sentiment go down. And initially we were a little bit shocked and we thought, oh, no, people didn't like it. But then we realized that was actually what we were looking for. It was perfect. People were calming down in that space and that changed their sentiment. So I think it depends what you want it for. And you need to use it again quite deliberately to make sure that it is aligning with your design. Certainly for sponsors, I think it's been very interesting. It's helped them because you can also get dwell time from that. You can also segment that by age and gender, just roughly speaking. So again, that can be very useful for a sponsor if they are targeting a certain age group, for example, if they are looking, to ensure that people are excited in their area. I think that along with other metrics, I think that can be interesting for people.
So as we wrap up, if you had to choose one sort of emerging trend for event professionals that they absolutely cannot ignore in the next 12 to 24 months, what do you think that would be?
Oh, just one. I mean, I guess it would have to be, a lot of what we've talked about, this intentional drive to create experiences and really focus on that. And for event professionals to really understand the power that they hold to drive objectives of businesses, of industries, to drive research and think about their events, the events they're putting on in those terms. And I think if they do, they can tell their story much more effectively because the world actually really needs events right now, whether it's with social connection, what we've been talking about, or whether it's helping businesses to drive growth, whether it's to drive research. The world really needs people to come together. And so as an industry, I think my biggest takeaway is that we have the confidence to put ourselves in that more strategic space and really understand the value of what we're doing and explain ourselves and articulate that value to our stakeholders.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I, whenever I discuss this with other professionals, I feel like the world is sort of like that meme of two dogs sitting by a fence gate and they're barking at each other. And then as soon as you move the gate, they stop barking and they come together, which is a very obtuse example, but it does sort of the visual just sort of popped into my head as you were speaking about that. So finally, I always like to ask this question at the end of every recording. So, we discussed this a little bit earlier about some of the frustrations and challenges that event organizers owners are facing. So what practical steps or strategies would you recommend or that industry professionals might need to do differently after listening to this episode?
Well, obviously, download the report and have a look at that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But also within that report, there are some really interesting research reports that are referenced, like the Freeman research, which does talk a lot about experience as well and designing experiences for the next generation. I think that's a fantastic report. They do a great job. And also CVent research as well is quoted in there. So I would really recommend event professionals do that. I would also recommend that depending on what sector of the industry people are, they get involved in their local trade associations as well, because the trade associations, MPI, SITE, PCMA, they're talking about this as well. They're doing education around this. Some of it's online, some of it's in person. And I think that is really valuable. And also in terms of the networks that you can build through those trade bodies or even community groups like ISHI, we work with them and they're fantastic organization as well for the corporate planners. That is important, I suppose I'm saying, for people both to keep abreast of the trends and to develop their own networks and communities, because that's what will really help them to think about intentional event design, think about inclusivity, and make sure that their events are the best ones that are being organized in the industry.
Excellent. And of course, we'll certainly put the link in all of the materials associated with this. But where can people go to access the report?
Yeah, if you just go to our website, imexevents.com, you'll find it there.
Excellent. Carina, thank you so much for joining me today. And it was such a pleasure speaking to you. And for the listeners, you can always go to productionvaluematters.com where you can subscribe and get access to more episodes of the podcast. Carina, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Production Value Matters, the Business Events Podcast, is brought to you by Burn Production Services. To learn more about Burn Production Services and how we can achieve your business goals with meaningful event designs and elevated production value, head over to burnproductionservices.com. For tailored AV consulting, check out theavadvisor.com, where you can book a free 15-minute consultation. Also, be sure to search for Production Value Matters, the Business Events Podcast, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for listening.